Greetings, everybody. We are now moving on, as you know, to the Communist Manifesto. We're just going to do 2 days on it. It is rather brief, but there's quite a bit of material there. A lot of important conceptual material, historical material. So I'm going to try and make sure to cover all of that in this lecture. And also, we will be focusing mostly on Marx here. I will talk just briefly about his companion, Engels, who was English, and who was part of the motivator for both Marx's work and obviously a contributor to the Communist Manifesto. So that's what I have planned. And I'm going to start just with talking a little bit about Karl Marx. There's a decent chance you've seen at one point or another a picture of Karl Marx. You may have actually seen some of the statuary as well of Karl Marx, but I'll just pop up a picture here. This one is been used multiple times in multiple places, and this is the standard pose of the day with the hand inside the jacket. Marx obviously was a very important figure historically and still really today. And he really saw his work along with the work of people now we recognize as important sociologists, Max Weber and Emil Durkheim, probably the most important. As a scientist, he did not see what he was doing as just mere theory. It involved data collection. It involved, looking at actually what was going on in society and studying it. And so when people talk about, the three most important of, founders of modern social sciences and sociology, Marx is often included along with Weber and Durkheim. So I just want to mention that briefly. In terms of Engels, and I'll share a picture here of Engels. You might not have seen him. His photograph and picture aren't used as much as Marx. So there's Friedrich Engels. So he was one of the people who really did a lot of the studies of the working class, and in particular, a piece that he published on the working class of people in England, looking at their conditions, right? Looking at their living conditions, essentially. What kind of jobs did they have? What kind of hours were they working? What were they paid? What were the challenges they faced in the places that they worked? So what were the kind of work conditions like for them in terms of health and safety? All those kind of things. And that was a real eye-opener for Karl Marx, who was already sort of, he was already interested in these kinds of themes. But I think Engels' work and reading his work on what was going on in England was a real motivator for him to kind of push him forward to kind of take the next steps with his own work. So Engels is certainly an important person here. So I just wanted to mention that. So a little bit about Marx and his background. Just give me a second here. So you can see he lived between 1818 and that should say 1883, not 1838. So 1818 to 1883, not 1838. Something looked odd about that. Born in southeastern Germany to a middle-class family. And his parents were actually Jews, but they converted to Lutheranism because of the increasing anti-Semitism that they were facing. So remember that anti-Semitism that we typically identify with that part of the world with the rise of the Nazi Party, and Adolf Hitler obviously had a really long history, and also a long history including in the part of the world that Marx is from. And if you wanted to have certain kinds of jobs, you could not be a Jew, and that included law. And Karl Marx's father was involved in law, so essentially to do that, he had to give up his Judaism. Marx studied law, history, and philosophy at the University of Berlin. and then in Jena. Um, and you can see that that background would have prepared him well for the kind of writing that he did on political philosophy. He did join a group called the Young Hegelians. I'll talk a little bit more about Hegel and his influence here. I think I've already talked probably previously about Hegel's dialectical ideas about history and the movement of history over time. So I'll talk about that a little more. They were a group considered of radical thinkers at the time, right? Radical here meaning people who want to change society, the political and economic arrangements, et cetera, in major fundamental ways, right? Progressives are typically people we talk about who want to make change that's not as radical. They're not necessarily talking about changing the basic foundations, of politics and economics, et cetera, but making adjustments, certainly, but not making radical changes. So when you see the term radical, radical means root, right? If you think about it in mathematics, right? So change things at the foundations, at the roots. And these young Hegelians actually broke away from their teacher Hegel and wanted to use his work and apply his work in ways that were not things that Hegel himself originally developed, but they wanted to apply his thinking to other areas. And certainly we'll see that Karl Marx also did that. He was blacklisted from teaching for his involvement with and association with these radicals. And so he worked a lot of his life as a journalist in Paris, in Brussels, and then in London. And he and Engels actually both spent time as correspondents for newspapers in this country, interestingly enough. And that included, I know Engels worked for the New York Daily Tribune. They worked, I think the New York Times, they also worked as correspondents. So that was, they were writers. They were very capable writers. They could meet deadlines, et cetera. So that was one thing that they tried to do to sort of make ends meet and give themselves the opportunity to do the work that they wanted to do with these different progressive and radical organizations. I mentioned Marx and Engels as wanting to see their work as empirically based, right? This was not just mere theory to them. I think people often think of that today when they think about the failures of communism, for example, that it's great, sounds great in theory, but when you put it into practice, it doesn't work out so well. And certainly there might be some truth to that, but we shouldn't want to have that lead us to think that what Marx and Engels were working with was just pure theory, right? They really did see what they were doing as empirically based, right? As a part of sociology as it was developing, and political science it was as developing as social sciences, and again, actually informed by historical events. And that word praxis here is useful too. They wanted to bring theory and practice together. That's from a Greek term. So they saw what they were doing really as sort of looking at actual conditions empirically and developing theory out of that, and then using that theory to try and change what was actually happening. So theory and practice sort of work in a kind of a full circle, with practice informing theory, theory then informing practice, and then you constantly work through that sort of that kind of loop and try and enhance empirically what's actually going on, what actually exists in practice, and enhance theory at the same time through that sort of constant loop of moving back and forth between theory and practice. And that is called praxis. And I think that's a helpful idea here to keep in mind. So let me show you briefly. This is something you may have also seen, though maybe not this particular picture, of a famous statue of Marx, who again is sort of a larger than life character, and you can sort of see that from this picture. This is obviously when they were developing this huge statue of Marx's head, very imposing looking. So that might be something you have seen before. And I do want to say a little bit too about um, Marx's death. He died essentially a stateless person, right, for his radical ideas. And as I know I said before, several of the people that we've been talking about over the course of the semester were people who at least were thrown out of their original homes for what they were doing that was considered, radical at the time. Here is a picture of what eventually became the rather regal-looking tomb of Marx. You might not be able to see that, but it says "Workers of all lands unite." It's important to recognize here that as Marxism developed, as communism developed, it was conceived and developed as a world movement. Hopefully you picked that up from the first parts of the Communist Manifesto that you read, that one of the challenges was that in many parts of the world, in North America and in Europe in particular, there was a growing concern about the living and working conditions of the modern worker, right? Especially with the development of factories and class divisions between the people who, as Marx would say, own the means of production, right? Who are the factory owners and the people that were working for them. And the fact that it was believed that the workers were very much being exploited by the factory owners. And there was also sort of a middle class at the time that would have been the people who would have directly run the factories, right? So they didn't own the factories, and they weren't the people down on the floor, doing the hands-on work, but they would have been sort of the middle class workers who, directed the workers, did the day-to-day running, of the factories and that sort of thing. And that was a growing class at the time as well. But this concern for the exploited working class was happening in many different places. And these are people from different cultures, different histories, speaking different languages. And that made it difficult really to make communism a world movement. But it was really believed that it had to be that for real change to take place, fundamental radical change to take place. You needed to bring together the resources you had from all of these workers around the world. And it was believed that the more you could unite those workers, the more power and authority and influence that they could have, and the more likely they would be able to leverage change in society. Whether or not it was thought that that change was inevitable, or whether or not it was thought that that change needed to be kind of pushed forward, even maybe if it was inevitable, or even if it believed it wasn't inevitable, and then you needed some kind of more potentially violent change to bring about better lives and working conditions for working class people. So the Communist Manifesto was published in multiple languages. It was to take into account and to incorporate what was happening in these different countries for these different workers. So it had to be very broad-based, and you'll notice that the terminology that you use, the discussion it uses, is very abstract and very theoretical. Not because it was itself a work that was just based on theory, but because it needed to be something that could apply to the different groups of workers in the different countries, right? It had to be a universalist sort of document. And I think that's something that's important to recognize about it. So following the death of his wife, Jenny, who actually was of a relatively wealthy class, she was actually a Prussian baron. And this is where I always sort of make the joke that would have made Karl Marx the Red Baron. But she passed away. And then she died in 1881, and then Marx developed a catarrh, which were pretty common at the time. Essentially, it was a swelling of the mucous membrane in the head due to infection. Infections were very common. They didn't have the same kind of medicines to deal with infections, especially ones that were really advanced at the time. And that kept him ill for the last 15 months of his life. And then again, he eventually died in 1883. Bronchitis and pleurisy and other things related to his infection and the fact that when you became very ill, you were basically confined to your bed, and that would often lead to, um, lead to worse kinds of illnesses. Um, that just were brought about from you being stationary and not moving around and not getting your blood going and your breathing going and everything else, that would make things worse. And that was certainly the case. People got tuberculosis, and other kinds of major illnesses. So as I said, he died a stateless person, and the family and friends in London sort of buried his body in 1883, um, because he was, sort of an outsider, a stateless person at the time. Eventually, however, he received a proper burial, um, that was, much more regal, as you can see from this picture. When there was sort of a recognition over time of the contributions that he had made, um, to science, to sociology as well. Obviously, as to communism, as unpopular as it is and was in certain parts of the world. Um, as communist revolutions were taking place in various places of the world, and we'll talk about some of those. Right, he becomes, somebody more to be celebrated than to be denigrated. Um, one of the important issues that I want to talk about relative to that is the issue of the difference between, um, what was intended to take place in these revolutions that would bring us from, sort of a capitalist economy through a socialist economy and into what was called pure communism. The difference between what the desired outcome was and what actually happened, and that's something I think again will be important to talk about and that we will talk more about. Um, I wanted to share with you a picture of an earlier version of the Communist Manifesto, and it has this again important, um, quotation on the front. And on his gravestone, it said, "Workers of all lands unite with the same idea. Working men of all countries unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. You have a world to win." And this was obviously, a version of it that was published, in Chicago. Um, this country did have a communist party for a time that had some degree of, influence, more so at the local, sort of the state level to an extent, but certainly not at is to much of an extent at the national level. Though there were, as there still are today, people running on the communist ticket for major political offices. Um, there was a time when they actually did get, at least a significant enough a portion of people, voting for, people in the Communist Party to sort of take note of and to see that it wasn't just, um, you know, a tiny part of the population that was interested in at least considering communism as a political and economic theory. And I think that speaks as much to the status of the working class as anything else, right? That they really believe there needed to be something that would happen that would improve their living circumstances and their work conditions and everything else. Um, so here's an edition that again that was published in the United States of the Communist Manifesto. Um, one of the major, um, mechanisms within, um, communism that I want to talk about has to do with, what's called, the Hegelian, the dialectical, sort of movement over time. And I want to share a brief slide on that with you here for a second. And this just shows what was called dialectical materialism. Um, the basic dialectic you can see on the left, and this dialectic, um, was used by lots of different thinkers, applied to lots of different things, and in fact, it was originally, or most famously, I should say, developed by the philosopher Hegel, um, in the world of ideas, as a part of his idealist sort of philosophy. And then some other people including a guy named Feuerbach and then later Marx and Engels, took that same dialectic and moved it from the world of ideas to the material world. And you can trace it back originally, at least as far as Plato and Socrates talked about a dialectic. It's a pretty basic idea. And originally, the form it took was actual dialogue, right? The same root as dialectic. I think I may have talked about this previously. And then it just became, rather than a dialogue between people who have different positions on an issue, kind of back and forth. And the idea was that they could, by that movement back and forth, by debate and discussion, that they could reach potentially a position in their argument that would be superior to their individual, arguments, so that they could, in a sense, learn from one another. And the basic movement there, as you can see here, and you'll recognize, is this thesis is sort of the original position, the original argument. Antithesis is the opposite. And that antithesis hopefully moves into a synthesis, right? That takes what's best about the thesis and antithesis and brings it into eventually a new thesis. And so that then becomes the starting place. And then there's a new antithesis to that, and so on, right? And the idea is that through that process, you can move forward. You can, in the world of ideas, the idea was you could come closer and closer to the truth. And for, originally that meant truth with a capital T, some ultimate, final, absolute truth. Later on, this movement was still used and adopted as something that didn't just involve people debating and discussing, but just intellectually in your own mind, you could undertake a dialectical sort of thought process, right? And eventually the idea was that maybe you couldn't reach an absolute capital T truth, but that you could at least see progress. You could at least move forward in your thinking, whether or not the idea is moving closer to a truth or not, that you could at least improve things. At least progress was possible through this sort of movement. And again, the philosopher Hegel kind of built on what had been developed previous to him, going back, as I said, you can see it in Plato and Socrates, a version of it in Aristotle, etc. So it has a long and kind of storied history, and obviously some of that vocabulary we still use today. What Marx really did, and Feuerbach, we won't really talk about, and Engels, is move it from the world of ideas to the material world. And by material world, they're talking about the world of economics and of property and of capital, of wealth. And so this is something that, again, I talked about the young Hegelians and the efforts of the young Hegelians and Feuerbach to move this from the idealistic idea, realm of Hegel to the material realm. And that movement, as you can see here, this is the kind of historical movement when you think about, sort of who are the people who are in power, who are the people who are not in power, who owns the wealth, who doesn't have the wealth, who works for whom, etc. Right? Originally, you have the patricians and the plebeians in very early forms of what you could identify as kind of an economic realm, to feudalism, right? The people that worked for the feudal lords, the manorial serfs, and just different sort of versions of that among the peasantry, right? Serfs were somewhat similar to slaves, as we talk about slavery, certainly in this country, right? They were pretty powerless. They had no choice of what to do with their lives other than, work for these feudal lords. We'll talk about the emancipation of the serfs as that happened in Russia. That'll be something that's discussed in Crime and Punishment when you read that, Dostoevsky's sort of most famous novel. Then the idea is out of that and out of the manorial serfs sort of trying to acquire their own power, trying to break away from the bondage, right, through different kind of revolutions. If you think about the revolutions that took place in the aristocracies and monarchies in Europe, right, and England and France, etc. That out of that develops eventually capitalism, or what's called bourgeois capitalism here, right? You have a class of wealthy owners. As this materialism morphs into, from sort of artisans, and if you think about artisans as they develop, sort of out of these manorial serfs, artisans can control the conditions that they work in. They're highly skilled. They actually developed guilds, and Marx talked about those guilds, right? Which were basically a way of having a monopoly over whatever it was that your guild produced. If you were iron workers, or if you made barrels, right? If you were coopers, you're carpenters, whatever kind of line of work you developed a guild out of that, and you developed fixed prices for how much you would charge for the things that you created and sold, what kind of conditions you worked in, etc. And it did take away some of the power of the individual artisans, but I think they realized that they ultimately would benefit from forming these guilds so that they weren't competing with each other. Because even though there's an upside to competing, there's also a downside to competing. And then, but they could still, again, through these guilds, they could have a monopoly. They could have some degree of power in whatever area, whatever region their guild, operated in. But then eventually, as the means of production modernize, right, you move from these artisans and their really high level craft skills that they had to factories, and to the de-skilling that goes along with eventually what we know as like assembly lines, right? So you have these capitalists, these people who invest this money in factories, in more modern, more updated means of production that were much faster, that were much cheaper. And you would invest great amounts of money in these businesses. So you think of the railroad industry, you think of the steel industry, the food service industry, all these kind of things that developed, and the names that we know, Carnegie and Vanderbilt, and all these big names that you're aware of, is the people who amassed great wealth, especially in the early 20th century in this country, for example. And the people that worked for them were ultimately de-skilled. When you're de-skilled, it means you basically have no power. At the same time of this de-skilling, there was a lot of immigration going on as well. And even though the workers who were de-skilled, and therefore, you might say, okay, I want a higher wage or I'm going to quit. They would say, go ahead and quit. You're de-skilled. We can find anybody to fill your position, especially these immigrants who just arrived today into the country. They want any kind of a job. They'll take the job, right? And so, once you were de-skilled, you basically had no leverage, right? Eventually, that is when workers come together and start to organize. And those workers' organizations were very powerful and had significant amount of authority in this country in the early 20th century. And eventually unions developed out of those. And as we know, unions still exist today in many areas, though they certainly don't have the power and authority that they used to. Teachers still have unions, and there are other kind of major organizations, segments of our economy that are unionized. And then, we know of the strife that created between factory owners, and the local governments were typically behind the factory owners, and they would use their police and agents of the police force that were actually just developed to deal with worker uprisings. And then they would, bring in state authorities and state, military, and then the federal military. One of the most famous instances of this was the Pullman strike in Chicago. I know about that because one of the people whose work I really studied, John Dewey, learned a lot and was just moving to Chicago at the time of the Pullman strike. As you might remember, the Pullman Company developed sleeping cars and railroads, and developed what was called a workers' town, which some of these other businesses did, where basically you build houses for your workers to live in, that they were all basically the same. You, instead of paying them in regular money, you paid them in scrip that was only good to pay for food and clothing and things at the stores that existed in these villages, worker villages. And, you know, a lot of these capitalists would try to present these things as these ideal kinds of towns because, you know, you had your housing taken care of, and you had food, you had a regular wage, you didn't have to go far to get your food and your clothing, and, you know, basic necessities were taken care of. But of course, it kept these people working at a very low wage. They really were powerless to go elsewhere or do anything else. And that's where the strikes basically occurred. There was a very violent strike in the Pullman town in Chicago where the military was brought in. Many people were killed. It was really horrible. And there were other places when these uprisings, you know, occurred. And this was some of the strife and the worker, you know, the labor organization, worker organization that Marx and Engels were trying to build on, that was occurring not just in this country, but also in other places. Much of it that was more advanced was occurring in England at the time, and in London in particular. So the idea is eventually there's this inherent conflict in this form of political and economic system, because the people who are really benefiting from creating these goods, taking raw materials and making finished products out of them, were the owners of the means of production, right? They would become very wealthy. Their stockholders would become very wealthy. When they invested in their businesses, the profit that they made, they invested in ways to further mechanize and automatize, right, their production methods, which meant that they needed fewer workers, and those workers were even more de-skilled. And again, less and less power, authority, control of your situation for the working class people, for these de-skilled workers. And so through this inherent conflict eventually, and you remember that Locke talked about this, right? About the fact that in his second treatise on government, that whatever labor you put into raw materials to make a finished product that people were willing to buy from you, you kept the added value from taking those raw materials and turning them into a finished product, and that added value was yours. Well, once you are working in these factories, that added value, the vast majority of it didn't go to you. Again, it went to the people who owned the factory that you worked in, the people that invested in and owned stock in the company, and in the people who owned these factories, again, investing in further updates to modernize their means of production. So, you know, what Locke was talking about there really didn't apply anymore, because you weren't really getting any real significant portion of the added value that you're creating to your the raw materials that you were making finished products out of. So that's important to emphasize here. So eventually the idea is, out of that, we end up with a proletarian workers' revolution, right? Proletarian was the working class. The bourgeoisie was the owner class in society. And out of that, you would move through, and they kind of skipped over socialism here. Ultimately, communism is the state that you would kind of move into. Now, what were called orthodox Marxists importantly believe that this kind of process was inevitable, that in each stage here of this political economic kind of arrangement in society, there was this kind of inherent conflict where some people had power and authority and others didn't. And eventually that would lead to some kind of a rebellion, some kind of a revolt or an overthrow, whereby you would have a new form of society that would develop new political and economic arrangements. And it was believed that these were inevitable, that you would eventually move through these different stages. Later, people who we might call neo-Marxists didn't believe necessarily in the inevitability of this process, and believed that you really had to, it had really to be forced. And even in Marx's day, there were these kind of subgroups within communism that believed in whether or not you needed to kind of let things take the proper course, right? Typically called the Mensheviks, And then those people who really said, okay, it might happen inevitably, but we should kind of push the envelope here. We should revolt. We needed, that power and authority we have to do that, typically called the Bolsheviks, to kind of force this process forward, right? And that was a major division within the Communist, party that I think is one of the things that ultimately weakened the party. And it happened to many of these radical parties, political parties. And of course, if you weren't one of those radicals, if you were a conservative that wanted to maintain the way society was functioning, you would do whatever you can to sow the seed of discord within these radical organizations, within unions and these different workers' organizations. And there were quite a few of them in the early 20th century, to try and weaken them by sowing discord, within them. So that is basically this sort of dialectical materialism and the kind of movement sort of within it that I wanted to share with you. And here more specifically, to give you a sense for the kind of difference between this form of dialectic and Marx and Engels and their communism versus and Hegel, as I mentioned, that so Marx agreed with Hegel's concept of struggle and resolution. That is the thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Synthesis becomes new thesis, antithesis, right? That same kind of movement out of the world of ideas, or spirit, as Hegel called it, which was sort of an overarching force in the world that ultimately would bring about change through sort of the world of ideas. And again, Marx and Engels and the communists moved it from this world spirit, the way we think, to material factors in society, which again, we're talking about the economic organization and political organization of society. And again, Marx believed that things change because of economics and necessity, not of thought. Now, certainly thought is an important part of that. And again, we see how they adopted this struggle and resolution concept from Hegel and utilized it in their own way. So it certainly is important. But ultimately, you've got to actually have people on the ground, as they say, right? Grassroots, in the trenches, the workers and the people who are working with the workers to bring about real change, bring about real fundamental change. And it was argued too, and I think this is important, and you can see this if you look at all of the kind of revolutionary changes in society. Typically, they necessitate a certain number of people from either sort of the class in society that is in power, or what we typically talk about as the middle class, to become enlightened and to assist the working class. And I think that's important to sort of recognize here. It typically is an educated class, a class that does have some degree of economic leverage. Typically that people fight over whose side they're going to be on, right? The workers want them on their side. The owner class wants them on their side, right? The really wealthy people, who are the big stockholders, et cetera. And so the wealthy people are trying to claim that they too can become wealthy stockholders and owners of the means of production. If they pull in their direction, the worker class will tell them, hey, the owner class doesn't really care about you. They want you to just fall into the working class, right? So sometimes there's the petit bourgeois class that was actually the class that we would maybe think of as the middle class, shopkeepers, et cetera, right? That we're trying not to fall into the working class, and ultimately wanted to believe that they too could be maybe wealthy through their efforts, their entrepreneurial efforts, many times. They were concerned that they would fall sort of into the working class, and eventually that becomes very dangerous, right? Especially for the working class, to not have that middle class anymore to be any kind of assistance, especially because it was a more educated class. It was a class that did have some degree of economic leverage at some level. etc. So this is how this movement, this dialectical movement in the world of ideas, sort of moves into the world of actual sort of on the ground change. Another slide I wanted to show sort of you here talks a little bit about the political spectrum. And this is interesting because it does raise some, I think, important issues here. So you might recognize this, right? And this is from the standpoint of somebody who's a supporter, obviously, of democracy, as we think of it as the political of the center, right? And you've got your right wing and left wing of democracy. So the left wing would be more liberals, right wing would be more conservatives. As you can see, the labels on the bottom here. Republicans, and the term conservative means you want to conserve the status quo, whereas liberals typically believe in social change and focusing on making changes to give more rights and freedoms, economic stability to all people, right, in society. Really believe in the necessity of having a middle class that can help bring about this change. And then you have on either side the extremes. So on the extreme right wing, you have fascism, right? So think about Italy, think about Germany in World War II, and the different forces of imperialism in World War II, like Imperial Japan. And then you have the extreme left wing, and you have communism there. And the label that's used there is dictatorship. Now, there is supposed to be a phase of what's called the dictatorship of the proletariat in the revolutionary process. The idea being that as the proletariat overthrows the bourgeoisie, and as they take control of the means of production in society, right, the factories, for example, that there is a period of a dictatorship of the proletariat. But eventually that's supposed to give way to something like democracy, at least in the more kind of mature forms of communism. Now, what happened ultimately is certainly what is more represented here on the political spectrum. It ultimately ended up being a dictatorship, right? And many people would have argued that this was inevitable, right? If you're the working class, if you're the proletariat, and eventually you are able to take over the means of production in society, and create your own dictatorship. First of all, you're probably going to attract at least certain of people who are, more conservative, and they see an opportunity to grab power by becoming part of this dictatorship of the proletariat. And other people who would come along, who would want power and authority for themselves, who might be well-intentioned and really believe that eventually they need to move towards this classless state of democracy, that they eventually become caught up in the power that the proletariat has. So that the proletariat might eventually realize, at least many people within it, many parts of it, that, why should we give up the power that we now have and share it? We finally have that power. Why should we give it up? Right. And so you do have this kind of dictatorship, this kind of conservatism developing in communist countries. The Soviet Union might be the best example, that in some forms actually does look more like fascism than it does like communism and what it was supposed to be, right? So that's an important difference here. You can talk about communism as it actually developed and the forms that it took, which do appear very different from ultimately what the mature forms of communism and what Marx and Engels were talking about in achieving a classless state of democracy, even though some people might still find that is very oppressive. We'll talk about that. What actually existed was something that really did look a lot more like a dictatorship. And growing out of this dictatorship of the proletariat, and the proletariat not wanting to give up the power that they finally had in their hands. And so that's one of the reasons that people will argue that communism didn't actually work, because the proletariat class and the people that became a part of it or came up through it who wanted to grab power for themselves ultimately didn't want to give up that power. And you also had all these different divisions within the Communist Party developing. Some who wanted to force the things towards the ultimate kind of communist revolution. People who didn't want to force them as much and allow change to happen. People were concerned about the way in which the proletariat dictatorship, the forms that it was taking, and et cetera. So we have, Vladimir Lenin, for example, right? And you have Trotsky, and you have all of these major figures, leaders developing during this time who have different ideas and different beliefs in terms of how and why things should happen, et cetera. And that ultimately also kind of leads to the dissolution of capitalism. So I have another slide here that it's sort of interesting. When I was looking to discuss with you the different, political economic orientations, I found, not surprisingly, that the ones that really were the most hopeful because they were the ones that were more objective. And it's interesting if you want to check this out for yourself. If you search for these, and you can actually just search for images of communism, capitalism, and socialism, and or even websites, and you look and see what the different websites are, you can kind of see why they are going to present things in a more biased way, in a more conservative way, or a more liberal sort of way. But the ones that were the most helpful were actually the ones that were the simplest, the ones that were the least descriptive, because they also tended to be the ones that were the less biased. So this is the one that I've ultimately kind of stuck with. And so you can see, if you think about in this country, this is certainly the political spectrum. It's important to notice that in other countries, let's take countries in Northern Europe, right? More Scandinavian countries, Finland, and Sweden, and Norway, those places, for example. The political spectrum as it exists is more to the left than the political spectrum is in this country. Socialism is more sort of accepted. And there are more government agencies and things that we would identify in this country as more socialist, like higher education, right, being paid for by the government, for example, and other kinds of social programs. And certainly those did develop in this country, especially during World War II with FDR, right, with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his New Deal to try and bring us out of the Depression. And some of those things still exist today, Social Security, for example. But we had major arguments in this country about socialism, and it has become a dirty word for many people, right? Conservatives believe that they can just use the word socialism and completely, and I have that be identified with anybody who's liberal, and have that be a major red flag, and then nobody wants to be on the side of liberals, right? That was the case years ago with the term communism, in part because socialism was somewhat respectable, right? But if you want to disavow, if you want to disparage anybody who's a liberal, you can actually just use the word socialism now, and that will apply. Some of that has to do with newer socialist programs and with Obamacare, right, and government-sponsored healthcare, et cetera, even though most people still seem to support it. It is important to recognize that. And some of you who have studied to or been to other countries know that the political spectrum is different from one country to another. You should also not, don't confuse the fact here that capitalism is in the middle and socialism is on the right side and communism on the left side, that is indeed shows the different parts of the political spectrum, right? The political spectrum here, ultimately, if you want to have these three groups, would be capitalism, socialism to the left of it, and communism to the left of that. But you can see the differences here, right? You've got total private ownership, and that's private ownership of the means of production. That means private ownership of factories, businesses, the people that create products and services, versus no private ownership of those products and services on the communism, and a more limited private ownership on the socialism side, right? Where you may have more government agencies taking over with certain kinds of products and services, healthcare, for example, or the post office. You'll notice the moves that were taken during Donald Trump's administration, the latter portion of it, to try and push towards privatization of the post office, for example, right? So capitalism, we have market forces, the laissez-faire idea, the invisible hand, that market forces control the economy and where it is with limited intercession of any kind of government agency. Now, we still have government agencies, the Fed, as it's called, who will adjust interest rates and those kind of things. But that's supposed to be really secondary. Market forces are supposed to do most of the change. You have very much central government and control of things on the communist side. And then you have some government and private entities working together on the socialist side. Class distinction, you do have major class distinctions in capitalism, right? I talked about the middle class and then the upper class and lower class. The middle class has been shrinking over time, which has even some people who would consider themselves capitalists and conservatives being concerned of what happens if you do have too much of a gap opening up between the middle class and the worker class and the wealthy class, that is dangerous and that will have negative consequences politically and economically if that happens. Production for profit for capitalism, production just focusing on basic needs within communism. You're not have a society that's based on conspicuous consumption and on some people having nicer automobiles and homes than other people. There's more of an economic focus on basic needs. And on socialism, it's most focused on societal needs, though there still is some kind of a profit motive there. And if you look at the different figures that we identify with the different elements here, you've got Adam Smith on the capitalist side. He wrote a famous book called The Wealth of Nations. And that Wealth of Nations is the text people most identify as the kind of Bible of laissez-faire economics. And that was written in the 18th century. And then you've got Karl Marx Communism on the left, identified with that. Charles Fourier, who was mentioned in the Communist Manifesto under socialism. Now, socialists historically have been seen as sometimes enemies of communists. The idea there being is that socialists don't really make fundamental change. They're identified more with progressives. And the idea is that socialists will make enough changes to make the working class happier, working for better hours and better wages and better working conditions and certain kinds of concessions to workers that are made just to keep workers happy so you don't have a major revolution take place and a major upheaval. It's kind of like the idea of letting off the steam a little bit, right? To make people happier, but you're not really making fundamental or radical kinds of change. So you could see Marx talked about a number of socialist organizations, and he talked about Fourierists, for example, and people in France who would be considered socialists. But many times historically, the communists would see themselves as working against the socialists. And socialism was, as I said, fairly respectable in a lot of parts of Europe and even in this country for a long time. When people recognize that we can't have young kids working in factories and people need to have a living wage and working conditions shouldn't be so horrible that so many people were losing their lives and working in factories and those kind of things. So it was respectable. Again, conservatives have really tried to challenge that idea over the last 20, 30 years, even I would say going back to the 1980s and the Reagan administration. But there you can see what some of the major sort of differences are. Now, it's really important here. People talk about no private ownership here. And sometimes we'll talk about no private property with communism. What is mainly being discussed there is ownership of the means of production in society when private property is discussed, for the most part. That's different from personal property. Communists did not want to take away everybody's personal property. Now, the fact that you would have production forces focusing on basic needs would mean that you're not going to have a whole array of automobiles and homes and clothing and so on that would distinguish people as higher class or upper class versus middle class or lower class, right? So you wouldn't have those, those kind of things available to you in a communist society. So your personal property is going to be different in terms of what's available to you. But communists did not believe in taking away everybody's personal property. The focus was really on the means of production. So when you see things, and when you see no private property, that's typically what's being referenced, is the means of production in society. And that should be contrasted with personal property. When we think of, the things that you own, the things that are handed down over the generations. Now there were, under communism, and still are today, questions about inheritance and inheritance tax, and should your inheritance go to your next, to your children, etc., because that can be a way of just maintaining the wealth in the same group of people versus having other opportunities for other people to acquire that wealth over time. So there's still debates and discussions about that, but nonetheless, for the most part, your personal property is yours. So I just wanted to emphasize that. Now, some of the vocabulary that was used in the different classes, let me just say a little more briefly about that here. Give me a second, and I will show you a slide that will look at the main classes here. And I think this is the correct one. So the two main classes, as I mentioned them, within Marxism. And again, this is sort of, in some way you could say there's a middle class here that is between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. It sort of really depends on who you ask and what framework you're using. Sometimes the middle class, again, shopkeepers or the petit bourgeoisie, as it was sometimes called, would be identified more with the proletariat, sometimes when the bourgeoisie. I'll get to that a little more in a minute here. So the proletariat refers to wage earners, right? Those who do not own the means of production and must sell their labor to survive. They also can't control the conditions of their labor the way artisans could under feudalism and under sort of a full-blown capitalist, forms of economic arrangements. And then you have the bourgeoisie, refers to the capitalists, those who own the means of production, the wealth of society. They control the working conditions for the workers, right, and everything else here. Now, again, for the middle class, the proletariat and bourgeoisie would be fighting, in some sense, over who would be on their side, right? The bourgeoisie would tell the middle class that, hey, you can be like us if you keep working hard, and being an entrepreneur, that you can start with your mom and pop shop and eventually be another franchise owner like McDonald's or Subway or whatever you might have. The proletariat also wants the middle class on their side because they do have the education and wealth and some political power and some economic power. And so you try to tell them, hey, you don't have a chance. You're not going to, 1 in a million people might be a McDonald's or a Subway, but the vast majority of people, that's not going to happen. You're better off helping us out because that will help you out in the future. And it doesn't help if our pay is so low that we can't afford to go to McDonald's or Subway or whatever else to buy your products anyway, right? So this is the way all these political forces kind of work between the different classes in society. And obviously that is sort of a quick and dirty summary. That's a real generalization, but I think it hopefully gives you a basic idea of the dynamic there. So the means of production for the proletariat, they don't own it and have to survive, again, by selling their labor, versus the bourgeoisie, who owns the means of production. And again, think about that in terms of Locke and the basic assumption of Locke and the kind of, and definitely in important ways, capitalist economics and the laissez-faire idea and some of the ideas that Adam Smith was working with, etc., can be traced back to Locke. And so that the proletariat kind of way can sort of make a Lockean sort of argument and say, according to Locke, we should, that the amount of added value that we give to raw materials by turning them into finished products, that should go to us, right? And use some of these early political economic sort of documents to, sort of make their case. The owner class is going to say, well, as the means of production have been modernized, we don't need your artisan skills anymore, right? We have mechanized and upgraded systems of production where we can make more and we can make it faster, and you're easily replaceable. So sorry, you're not going to get most of the profit that comes from the things that you help to produce, because you're not really using much of your labor anyway. And of course, in terms of having skilled labor, you're not, but you might end up standing on a very dangerous factory floor, 10, 12 hours a day in really horrible working conditions, et cetera, getting almost no pay. So the proletariat is exploited by the bourgeois class, and minimum wage labor exploited by the bourgeoisie class. And there are important issues that are discussed, and I think that are important in terms of thinking about the kind of economic system we live in today. This is obviously a very capitalist country, and we do often debate and discuss questions about wages and about a living wage, and what is the minimum wage. Certainly, people who earn that minimum wage are really care about it a lot because they want enough money that they can live a decent life. On the other hand, people who own the means of production in society also, they have an interest in it, because they want people in that working class to be able to buy their products. If the minimum wage is so low that people can't buy their products, that's going to hurt their economic bottom line. However, they also have an interest in keeping that minimum wage lower, because then they can pay their workers less. And then when there are these economic struggles of boom and bust that Marx says are inevitable in a capitalist economy, that they will downsize, they will fire people, that after the economy improves, like after the 2008 recession, you will not hire certain people back because you'll have fewer people doing more work, or you will have more fully modernized. That really happened after the recession of 2008 in this country. A lot of people weren't hired back because the people that they kept on were given more jobs to do and wanted to keep those jobs, so they're still doing more work. Or over time, there was more modernization of production that took place. The economy even further moved towards a service economy where you needed fewer workers, so the people weren't rehired, right? So, they benefit from keeping the wages down. So you can see that from both sides, from the owner class in society. They want enough people to be able to buy their products, but at the same token, they don't want to have to pay their workers a lot so that they can have more profit, etc. Obviously, the proletariat class really wants to have that wage. And so there is a difference between the minimum wage and what we call now a living wage. A long time ago, you can sort of identify the living wage and the minimum wage as one and the same. The minimum wage basically was a living wage. That's certainly not the case now. And of jobs that have been created in the last 30 years or so in this country, many of them are minimum wage jobs that are not living wage jobs, right? And they're not the kind of job that you can raise a family on, pay for any kind of higher education on, as expensive as that is, right? You have to go into debt to pay for higher education, all these kinds of things. So that's a big point of debate and discussion. And you certainly saw it occurring a lot during the election, the most recent presidential election, and the senatorial, the larger congressional elections, because, that becomes a big issue. If you wait a long time to raise the minimum wage so it's closer to a living wage, it does make it harder on businesses, because all of a sudden they've got to pay their workers a lot more. And that is going to hurt their economic bottom line, and they might even go out of business depending on their profit margin. However, if you raise it in regular intervals just by a little bit, right, things can adjust more smoothly, and you're less likely to run into these situations where all of a sudden these businesses are really having an economic problem because they're all of a sudden having to pay their workers a lot more money. But it's hard to get people to agree to these, having what might be called sort of a rational policy for raising the minimum wage so it stays closer to the living wage. So we run into these situations where we have no choice but to have these larger raises in the minimum wage because the living wage has gotten so much higher. There's a similar dynamic that has happened in the SUNY system with tuition and what's called a rational tuition policy. The idea being, rather than raising the tuition in SUNY every 10 years and having it be a huge increase, do smaller incremental increases yearly or every 2 years that people can adjust a little more to, right? And all of a sudden having to adjust from, your freshman year, you're paying, one tuition, and then your sophomore year, it's, several $1,000s more, or 8,000, or, whatever it might be, right? But because of the difficulty of getting people to agree on raising, the minimum wage to make it close to the living wage, or agree to tuition policy rate, wages and tuitions, where you have a more rational tuition policy, you end up with situations where you're behind the 8 ball, as we are, I think, today, in having the living wage and the minimum wage be so different. We did get rational tuition policy with SUNY, and I think it's helped the situation. But as we all know, the more higher education is viewed as a private good and not a public good, the more the idea is that people should have to pay for it themselves and take out whatever loans they need to pay for their higher education. So, as the political spectrum sort of changes, all of that changes as well in terms of whether or not higher education is viewed as a public good or whether or not it's viewed more as a private good. And lastly here, I'm going to share with you a slide that talks a little bit about, get us a little more into the way in which change can take place according to the Marxist perspective. And that has to do with, again, workers organizing to try and bring about change. And we talked about that, that famous quotation, "Workers of the world unite," or workers of all lands, or workers of all countries, whatever the vocabulary is used there. And a lot of that will occur, according to the Marxist kind of perspective, by having people in the working class recognize that they are indeed a class of people who are being taken advantage of, that they don't deserve to be in the situation they're in. And a lot of that comes through education, whether it's formal education or whether it is, publishing pamphlets and other kinds of things, or using the media to inform working class people that you don't deserve to be in the situation that you're in. It's not just you. You're not an individual failure. There's inequities in the system. And until the system changes, you are going to be in the same boat, right? So this is where the issue of ideology becomes really important here, right? And does the dominant ideology tell you that everything's fair, that you've got as much opportunity as anybody else does to move your way up the socioeconomic ladder, as long as you work hard and do the right thing, and the system is fair? And we really believe in this country in a meritocracy where you can work your way up from the bottom, right? And so that ideology is really prominent. It's very prominent in the media, in the political realm, in education, right? Because we want to believe that that is indeed the case. And there's certainly instances of people who are able to kind of work their way up from the bottom. On the other hand, there are people that argue that that ideology is largely false or really flawed, that there are all kinds of barriers to working your way up from the bottom, that the playing field is not level. Everybody doesn't get the same quality education, for example. And that's a key to having opportunities in life and being able to improve your economic and your social situation, right? So that's where ideology is really important. And that's where the issue of ideology in relation to the news media is really important. And we certainly, when I was growing up, You had the major news agencies, NBC, CBS, ABC. They were, they were all viewed as, maybe they had a slightly different political orientation, but they weren't that different. And then CNN came along, and CNN was thought to be in the middle. That was, if you want to know something that's fair and unbiased and completely objective, it's CNN. Now we know that the different news organizations all sort of have their own niche that they've carved out, and that people will watch whatever news agency tells them what they want to hear based on their economics, their political beliefs and economic beliefs to an extent, right? Whether it's more conservative or more liberal, et cetera. Those are different ideologies, right, that are being offered up by those different news networks. The same is true of the print media, et cetera. You can find more political views in the part of the political spectrum online. And I think a lot of people are also interested in, what do the news agencies think of the BBC in England and other places to get more views. But the issue of ideology is really important. What ideology are people exposed to? What is the dominant ideology? Is that ideology changing at all? And how is it changing, and what directions, right? Because that influences this question here in this slide of class consciousness versus false consciousness. According to the Marxists, to have any fundamental change in society, you have to change people's consciousness. You have to change their beliefs about the situation they exist in and whether or not they deserve to be in the situation that they exist in. So you have to, in a sense, shed your false consciousness through education and being exposed to an alternative ideology. So as it says here, false consciousness is a way of thinking that prevents an individual from perceiving the true nature of their economic situation. You tell people that, their situation is okay, that they're living a good life, that they should be happy, etc. A class consciousness is when you become aware of your own social and economic class, and you become aware that you're a part of a larger class, right? And you're not just, an individual, and that your life is not only is not being controlled even primarily by you as an individual. These other forces are controlling your future, these larger political and economic forces. So again, on the false consciousness side involves people who do not realize that their true social and economic situation in society, right? Versus a class consciousness where you really become aware of the fact that you're part of a larger class. False consciousness, who hold the values and beliefs that benefit the ruling class and do not understand why they're being exploited. Class consciousness workers understand that they are being exploited. So basically, what you're trying to do as a Marxist is create class consciousness in people. Help them to see that they're not getting a fair lot in life, that the playing ground is not even, that the system is rigged against them. They don't deserve to be where they are, and that their chances of rising to the top from the bottom are absolutely minuscule. And that is needed for people to get together and to force change, right? Now, false consciousness does not just exist in the worker class, it also exists in the bourgeoisie class, the owner class. The false consciousness in the worker class is when people believe that they deserve to be on the bottom. They're stupid, they're lazy, they don't know what they're doing, they're inferior, maybe they're culturally inferior, they're new immigrants to the country, their language is inferior, so they believe they're on the bottom. By the same token, the people on the top believe they deserve to be there. They got there because they worked hard or their parents worked hard, right? They deserve to go to good schools. They really applied themselves, and they deserve everything that they get. That is a kind of false consciousness also on their part. So false consciousness exists in both groups, the haves and the have-nots. The haves believing they deserve everything they got, right? The have-nots believing that they deserve to not get very much, right? When we think about white privilege, when we bring in issues of race and and ethnicity, that's a part of this, right? White privilege is a recognition on the part of people who are the haves in society, largely, not always, but largely, that they benefit from just the fact that they're white, and that is more likely to make them into a higher class than a lower class. Now, again, that's a generalization, but that's where the socioeconomic dimension, that's where the racial and ethnic dimension, the cultural and linguistic dimension, all of that becomes a part of the ideology in this issue of false consciousness versus class consciousness. So as I mentioned, those people who are trying to bring about radical change are hoping to find at least a certain number of people who are the haves in society, who recognize things are uneven and are willing to share, are willing to help educate and work with and for, the worker class. However, there always is a concern that the people who are the middle class people working with the lower class are not really trying to make major change, and they're just going to slow up the progress and take the voice away from the working class people. So there are lots of really complicated sort of political economic dynamics behind that. So that was my lecture on the Communist Manifesto and on Marx and Engels, again, who are my focus here. One of the big questions to ask yourself is, where did Marx and Engels go wrong? If you look at the kinds of problems, flaws, conflicts in capitalism that are kind of pointed to by Marx and Engels, I think you can at least see that those have been points of concern by a lot of people in society, and certainly liberals will point out those as points of concern. What happens when companies downsize? What happens when, let's say, Walmart creates, opens a store in Geneseo and says they're going to hire all these workers who are out of work, and it's going to be great for the economics and the employment of the situation. And then over time, as they further mechanize and modernize their store, they hire fewer and fewer people because they have automatic checkout, so they don't need to hire nearly as many checkout people. So they're reinvesting in their business, so it's more profits for them and their stockholders, and not as many jobs are available for people in the area because they've invested, right, in the company. What happens because of that, right? So, and I think people are, so there are concerns of like anybody who would consider themselves as being liberal, and even some capitalists, people who are more conservatives, who are worried about worker revolts and those kind of things, of the kind of things that Marx and Engels talk about. So the question is, what do we do about those kind of things to create more equality in society? If Marx and Engels went wrong, where did they go wrong? If some of their diagnosis was correct in the concerns of some of the flaws or inherent problems of capitalism, what's the solution? If their solution wasn't the correct one, certainly attempts to apply it looks like they didn't turn out so hot. If we look at, for example, the Soviet Union, Cuba, China, and other places, if they look like they turned into more dictatorships and ultimately look more fascist than communist, what is the solution? Is it a form of socialism? That's what they've kind of decided in places in Northern Europe. Is it something else? Right? Those are questions that you need to sort of ask yourself. So I hope you found that helpful. And we'll finish up the rest of the reading. And again, if you have any questions about any of the things from the Communist Manifesto, from the rest of the reading, or from my lecture, please let me know. I will talk to you later. Thanks.